Welcome back to Rediscovering Foods. Today, we're traveling nearly 2,200 years into the past to taste one of the most surprising desserts of the Roman Republic, a cake called placenta. Yes, you heard that right. This isn't about biology, it's about food. Placenta was a layered cheesecake filled with honey and cheese, baked on fragrant bay leaves, and it was one of the earliest written recipes we have from Rome. But behind this cake lies the story of one of Rome's most famous statesmen, fierce political debates, women's protests in the streets, and even a linguistic legacy that still shapes the words we use today.
The word placenta comes from the Greek plakous, meaning flat cake. The Romans borrowed the recipe, just as they borrowed much of their culinary world from Greece. Centuries later, physicians saw that the afterbirth organ, with its layered, flat structure, reminded them of dough, and so they used the same word. That's how placenta went from meaning cake to meaning organ. What's fascinating is how long this food metaphor lasted. In German, the biological placenta is still called Mutterkuchen, literally mother cake. In Danish, it's Moderkage. Dutch has Moederkoek, Swedish says Moderkaka, and in Norwegian, it's Morkaka. So across Europe, people literally called it a cake. It's a striking reminder of how food terms shape how we see the body itself.
Most historians agree that placenta, and by extension, baklava itself, traces its roots back to ancient Greece. Some even argue that its story begins as early as Homer's Odyssey, written around 800 BC, where we find mention of thin breads sweetened with walnuts and honey. By the 5th century BC, Greek poets were already praising richer versions. Philoxenos, in his poem Dinner, describes how at the end of a feast, hosts would bring out a cheesecake made of milk and honey baked into a pie. Soon after, the word plakous, meaning flat cake, appears frequently in Greek literature as a dessert or second-table delicacy. The food poet Archestratus commended the Athenian style of plakous, lavishly drenched in honey and filled with nuts and dried fruits. In the 4th century BC, Antiphanes, a contemporary of Archestratus, gave perhaps the most ornate description. A cake made of wheat flour and goat's cheese, layered and sweetened, a carefully constructed dish that many see as the direct forerunner of the Roman placenta. From Greece, the cake's influence spread outward. In Rome, Cato the Elder recorded a recipe for placenta in his De Agricultura, layering dough sheets with cheese and honey in a style strikingly similar to cheesecake or baklava. Later, in Byzantium, the sweet evolved into new forms. Sources mention placuntus tedi romanus, a cheesy placenta, and copto plakous, a layered pastry regarded by food historians as the ancestor of modern terapita and baklava. Through Byzantium, the dish entered Armenian cuisine as plagindi, plagunda, or pagagand, all meaning cakes of bread and honey. From there, it traveled further east. Medieval Arabic cookbooks, such as the Wusla ila al-Habib, describe iflagun, a version carried into Syria by Armenian migrants from Cilicia during the Crusader era. Thus, the dish may have reached the Levant in the Middle Ages via the Armenians, many of whom migrated there following the first appearance of the Turkish tribes in medieval Anatolia. But the story does not end there. Across the Balkans and Eastern Europe, variations endured for centuries. In Romania, the placenta, still eaten today, preserves the spirit of the ancient placenta as a baked flat pastry with cheese. In Vienna, it survives as the palacinke, a thin, crepe-like pancake that spread widely through Central and Eastern Europe, appearing in Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, and the Slavic North. Each culture left its own imprint, but the layer heart of the dish remained. Even today, on the Greek island of Lesbos, the name placenta survives. Here, it refers to a baklava-like pastry, layered with nuts and soaked in honey, sometimes flavored with ouzo, a living echo of the ancient plakous. So, from the feasts of Athens to Roman farms, from Byzantine Constantinople to Armenian villages, from Levantine courts to Romanian hearths and Viennese cafes, the placenta cake reinvented itself again and again, yet always carried forward its sweet, layered soul.
We know the Roman recipe for placenta thanks to Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, 234 to 149 BC. Cato was no chef. He was a statesman, general, and one of Rome's fiercest moral guardians. He lived through the Punic Wars and ended almost every speech with his famous line, "Carthago delenda est," or "Carthage must be destroyed." But Cato also wrote De Agricultura, the oldest surviving work of Latin prose, where he recorded farm practices, wine recipes, and household management, including the earliest written version of placenta cake. For him, food was moral as much as practical, simple, honest, rustic. Cato fought against luxury in Rome. He supported the Lex Orcia, limiting the number of guests at banquets, and opposed the repeal of the Lex Oppia, which had restricted women's display of wealth during wartime. In fact, Roman women famously staged mass protests against him in 195 BC, gathering in the streets until the law was overturned. To Cato, indulgence was dangerous, but a sweet like placenta, made from farm produce, fit within his idea of wholesome Roman values. So when Cato describes placenta, made by layering sheets of wheat dough with cheese and honey, baked on bay leaves and drenched in syrup, it's not just a recipe. It's a glimpse into how Romans thought about farming, morality, and even national strength.
But not all of Cato's advice was so symbolic. Much of De Agricultura is startling in its bluntness. Cato tells masters to work slaves hard, feed them sparingly, and sell them off when they grow old. He treats farm workers like tools, to be used, replaced, and discarded. So while placenta seems like a joyful, festive dish, it was born in a world where farming wealth rested on the backs of enslaved labor. Every bite of Roman food, from wine to bread to sweets, was tied to the harsh realities of conquest and exploitation.
To make this ancient Roman placenta cake, you'll need, for the tracta, 120 grams of groats, preferably spelt or emmer, 240 grams of flour, 177 milliliters of water, and 15 milliliters of olive oil. For the crust, 120 grams of flour and 60 milliliters of water. For the filling, about 790 grams of crumbly sheep's or cow's cheese, 255 grams of honey, and fresh bay leaves, plus extra olive oil and honey for finishing. We start with the tracta, the Roman pastry layers. Coarsely grind the groats and soak them in water for about a day. Then mix them with flour to form a dough. Add water sparingly. The dough should be dry, but workable. Knead for about 10 minutes until smooth. Divide into 4 to 6 discs and roll each thin like a flour tortilla. Lay them out to dry for several hours or overnight. Next, the crust. Make a well in the flour and gradually mix in water until it forms a dough. Roll it out into a large disc, about twice as wide as your final cake. For the filling, rinse the cheese 3 times to remove excess salt and soften it. Drain thoroughly on the last rinse. Mash the cheese until smooth and mix in the honey until fully incorporated. Preheat the oven to 150 degrees Celsius. Oil fresh bay leaves and line your baking dish. Lay the crust over them. Brush a tracta with olive oil and place it in the center of the crust. Spread a layer of cheese and honey mixture on top. Repeat with all layers, finishing with an oiled tracta on top.
Fold the crust over to enclose the cake. Cover and bake for about 70 minutes. If you want a golden top, uncover and bake another 10 minutes. Remove the cake from the oven and brush with extra honey. Slice and enjoy a fragrant, sweet, layered dessert halfway between cheesecake and baklava, straight from ancient Roman kitchens.
Placenta shows us how food crosses borders. It was Greek in origin, Roman in adaptation, and its descendants survive in Balkan and Middle Eastern layered pastries to this day. It also reminds us how food reflected Rome's deepest anxieties: the fear of luxury, the control of women, the discipline of soldiers, and the harsh use of labor. Even a cake could embody Roman ideas about morality and power. And through language, placenta lives on in ways the Romans could never have imagined. Every time modern Europeans call the placenta a mother cake, they unknowingly echo the kitchens of ancient Rome. When we bake this ancient cheesecake today, we're not just recreating a dessert, we're tasting history, the speeches of Cato, the protests of women, the warnings of Pliny, and the labor of Roman farms. Food wasn't just fuel for the Romans, it was culture, identity, and politics, baked into every bite. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember, every meal tells a story. Sometimes, even the story of an empire.